I was 22 and bored in a way that felt like a small empty room. I took the summer job at Red Fern because it was a way to be useful and outside, because the pay was enough for rent if I saved, because the director, an ex-teacher with a laugh like a wind-up toy, said, "You can do cabins, Sammy, kids like you." That was the kind of endorsement that slides into the empty spaces of your life and settles. I arrived with a duffel and a chest of novels I never opened, with a pair of boots that still held the city, and a heartbeat of expectation that was mostly polite. Camp was small, the sort of place that never tried to be anything but a camp. A ring of pines kept out the road and the road kept out the world. The lake shone like old glass when the sun hit it. Cabins were wooden boxes on stilts, paint flaking politely, the names whittled into the porch rails. Red Fern, our cabin, had a crooked porch swing that complained in the wind and a scoreboard nailed to a tree where councillors kept track of canoe races and firewood relays. The air smelled like pine cleaner and oatmeal, and the faint, constant tang of metal frames and sunscreen. The election was exactly the kind of thing you expect kids to do with spare time, dramatic, unnecessary, destined to be forgotten. They'd voted to appoint a leader of games, someone to wear the paper hat at Capture the Flag, someone to settle disputes about who was up next for stories. Jamie, with her permanent scabs and laugh that sounded like a switch being flicked, suggested they pick something different. "Something that won't yell at us," she said. "Something that won't take naps." Aaron, who liked lining up leaves by color, found a shoebox in the arts and crafts shed and, the way kids do, declared it a podium. Inside the box was a worm, thin, mottled, a pale ribbon of earth that pulsed against the corrugated cardboard, as if it had found a heart in there and wouldn't let it go. The children, all of them, Jamie, Aaron, the girl with the braid who braided gossip like friendship into her hair, the boy with the inhaler who always held the strap of his backpack like it had instructions, crowded around and solemn as a council. They named it Mr. Soft because the worm was, if nothing else, soft. They put a pebble in the box. They put a bit of marshmallow. They made a paper crown and set it, unmistakably proudly, on the shoebox lid. It was charming and absurd, and slightly sticky with sugar, and the councillors laughed. We laughed. The director came by with his wind-up chuckle and said it was the best kind of leadership, playful, ephemeral. "Let them have their kingdom for a week," he said, and put his hand on my shoulder and left it there as if the hand itself were a seal. We chalked it up to summer camp law. The worm got its hat. The worm that afternoon got a little applause. If you've ever worked around groups of children, you'll recognize the way a small thing becomes a binding story. Tell 10 kids a good lie, and by noon, it's a truth. Tell them a ritual and it sticks. Tell them a secret, and they will guard it like it's theirs by blood. That's what the election did. It made something small into a shared authority. It made Mr. Soft an office. From the first week, the changes were tiny. They set up a schedule by the box. They petitioned the councillors to allow 3 minutes of silence before meals, because they said Mr. Soft liked it quiet when he ate. They would press their palms to the dirt and look skyward and say, in a voice that tried to be solemn, and mostly sounded like it was borrowed from a scene in a movie, "Softest peace." It was a nonsense phrase. We smiled and told them to be quick to dinner. They did. I noticed the details because that's how you keep a cabin running. You keep track of who needs a bandage, who snores, whose underwear is in whose dresser. Kids left offerings, an apple core, the soft corner of a graham cracker, by the shoebox, like an altar. Later, the offerings included things you would notice if you were paying attention: bits of fabric from the arts shed, a crumpled piece of a councillor's map, a small, flattened packet of medicine someone had meant to dispose of. Nothing dramatic in itself, small like threads, and children take threads and weave rope. The refrains came next. First it was "Softest peace" whispered over mashed potatoes, then "Soft is patience" hummed in the bunk at lights out, like a lullaby gone unrelated to the words that made it. Once during an art lesson, the girl with the braid traced the worm's form in clay and whispered, "Soft is quiet." We shrugged. It was art camp. They had their forms. Staff reactions were exactly what you'd expect when adults are busy, a little bemused, a little indulgent. The director pretended to be shocked and then clapped for the children's imagination. A councillor would take a photo and post it with a caption about the camp's spirit and creativity. When Mr. Soft became in effect a mascot, the office made a migration of jokes, T-shirts, a fake newsletter headline, but nothing thoughtful. Nobody stopped to listen when a child began to change how they moved. You can tolerate a lot if you believe it will pass. I told myself this. I told myself I was just being watchful and not ominous. I wrote notes in my head about where neatness of routine blurred into rigidity of habit. Jamie stopped arguing. She would take being picked on by other kids and fold it into a small, aching smile. Aaron, who had been the sort to hum constantly, hummed only in patterns that matched the timekeeping of the camp bells. The boy with the inhaler began carrying it inside the cabin, not on the strap of his backpack. Other kids noticed, asked where it had gone, and the boy would smile and say he doesn't like it when we struggle. He said it with the same cadence he used to order snacks, as if he were telling you the weather. I asked him once softly about his inhaler, and he did not look at me. He doesn't like it when we struggle, he repeated, small, like a fact about the world. It's easier when you stop trying. How do you argue with that from a child who still needs your permission to go to the bathroom? You say nothing, you make a plan to watch more closely. You expect staff to intervene. That is another thing you are taught when you are small. Adults notice, adults protect, but adults have other jobs at camp. The director had a book of fees to reconcile. Another counselor had a fiancé in the city and a phone that never stopped ringing. They believed in chance and weather and the imagination of children. It's a phase, they said. Let them have their rituals. When I voiced concern, the director gave me a look that combined the exhaustion of someone who'd seen 30 summers and the precise non-committal shrug of someone who did not want to be the person who took fun away from children. Quiet is an easy thing to undervalue when you're paid to keep things noisy. Quiet looks harmless. Quiet can be poetic. Quiet can be an empty room waiting to be filled. The contagion took time. It moved like damp spreading under a rug, unseen until you lift a corner and find mildew. At first it was limited to Red Fern. Then a canoe race ended early because the other cabin's team refused to make noise when they landed. Their counselor laughed and said they'd been practicing softness as a joke and meant to write it up as an activity. Another counselor stopped answering the radio during cleanup for respect. The restrained calm folded into the schedule like an extra day of the week. There were synchronized wake-ups at dawn. The children all rose, made their bunks with nearly the same efficiency, and lined their shoes precisely the same way down the cabin walk. They moved as if some committee had mapped their bodies in invisible ink. Management noticed other things. Supply boxes unaccounted for, small tools missing. A box of bandages vanished from the infirmary. Someone's key went missing. My concerns were answered with good-humored phrases. Kids will be kids, they'd say, and then go on with life. No paperwork, no emergency meeting. The director told me to keep cool. Camp is a microcosm, he said, and half smiled. They make their own governments. That phrasing should have been a red flag. Government sounds like a term you use when structure becomes desire. At the time it just sounded like something else I filed away. The rituals grew precise. It stopped being offerings and started being orders. The children prepared a place for the box under an old stump near the edge of the clearing. They cleared a patch of earth, set down a circle of leaves, and laid the shoebox there between two stones. They slept nearby sometimes, curled in sleeping bags like the spokes of a wheel. They protected the places where Mr. Soft was allowed to be. In the middle of the night, I would walk past the clearing and hear murmured words like mantras. Soft is peace. Soft is patience. The repetition, which at first sounded like the incantations of a school play, then the last line of a lullaby, began to register as a rhythm enforced rather than chosen. One morning a counselor, Maya, a good-natured woman who made everyone oatmeal with raisins and never complained, wasn't on the staff list. She had been in charge of knots and had a laugh that flared at inappropriate moments. We thought maybe she'd gone home, maybe an emergency. The director said she'd called to say she had to help her sister. A week later we found her bag, left behind by the arts and crafts shed, her knuckle still raw from where a knot had rubbed, but no one could say when she had left. Another counselor, Dan, was late to a shift, and there was no call. People mentioned both absences as if they were minor stains. "They go," was the phrase, casual, like a campfire smoke that you tell yourself will drift away. I began to take small covert notes. Who was present, who was not. The children's faces were the key. They were the same, their expressions like china kept in a cabinet and only occasionally taken down. The hush of their movements was pristine. If anything happened at camp that required energy, they had learned not to expend it. When two boys began to argue over a rope swing, the girl with the braid took one look and stepped between them as if she'd been deputized. She said softly to both, "We don't struggle, it makes him sad." They let go. There was a night I remember in particular. It had rained early, a clean, sour rain that left the pine needles smelling like copper. I had been in the staff room folding a shirt when I heard the sound, a chorus of soft breaths from the direction of the stump. It was not wind, it was not frogs. It was a pattern of inhalations and exhalations that seemed designed to reduce noise. I told myself it was the kids sleeping, and that was why they breathed as one. But I could feel in the air itself the pressure of something ordered. I followed the sound later that week. I told myself I was going to check on the box, that I was just covering my shift. I took a flashlight even though the moon was thin. I kept my phone on vibrate. I approached the stump slow enough to hear my own shoes on the path. The clearing glowed faintly from the moon, and the stump with the shoebox was not where they kept it now. Someone had moved it, as if reality itself wanted to shift the spot. Trails of dirt led away toward the back of the camp, toward the place where the ground softened and the pines crowded together as if to whisper. I found the entrance by accident. There was a hollow under a fallen root, a thinned place in the dark where the earth had given way. The smell that rose up was of turned soil and something else, earth after rain, and something animal sweet and faint, like a suggestion of compost. The flashlight beam revealed a little hole, just big enough for a kid to crawl into, rimmed with bits of cloth and leaves. There, tucked like a secret, was a rope ladder, frayed and tied to a root. I paused. My heart, being human in the presence of odd things, went fast and then slow. I thought of the director's laugh and the missing counselors. I told myself to go back to the cabin, to sleep, to file it away. Instead, I slid my shoulder into the ladder and climbed. The tunnel was not grand. It was narrow, low. A child's tunnel you imagine in basements, irregular and smelling of damp wood. It sloped down, and the air closed around me. The light of my flashlight carved out the shape of small hollows cut into the earth like alcoves in a cathedral. Each hollow had a neat, clean bed of leaves and a child lying very still. Beside each child, in the small concave, rested a worm. The first time my light found one, I had to stop walking. The worm was not extraordinary on its own, just a worm, gleaming and pale. But the child beside it, Jamie, lay on her side with her hand curled near the worm, as if to keep it company, and her breathing matched the worm's tiny, damp efforts. Their chests rose and fell in almost identical time. When I reached down and moved Jamie's hair from her forehead, she did not wake fully. She blinked once, very slowly, and when she spoke it was a voice that seemed borrowed. "He doesn't like strings," she said. "They tangle it." I did not yet understand the way the children had folded themselves around the worms. My mind moved in stuttering logic. Animals, pets, a child's affiliation. I nudged another child with my foot. He did not startle. He did not so much as twitch. The worms rested like punctuation, present, unobtrusive. I found the missing counselors further along. Maya was tucked in a hollow, eyes open and bright, but the stance of her body was passive, like she was listening to something I could not hear. Dan was there too, his jaw slack with sleep, but breathing even. When I shook Dan's shoulder, he blinked and, like a small motor being reset, his features arranged themselves into a nostalgic recognition, and he said, plainly, "Oh, Sammy, there you are." He sounded like a man waking from a period of deep sleep, not like someone dragged into consciousness. I tried to rouse Jamie properly. I called her name and spoke until my throat was dry. She murmured something that melted into a whisper. "Softest peace." It was the phrase they had been saying for weeks, and hearing it in a tunnel, the damp and the earth pressing around us, made it a pronouncement instead of a phrase. Above us, the pines sighed. Behind the children, the worms shifted, small and indifferent. A sudden logic seemed to click in my head then. The worms were not imposing themselves on the children. The children had built a world in which the worms had a place of authority. They had organized the camp around the presence of something small. The worms were small. The children's obedience was not. I reached down and with a hand that felt unreal in its firmness, I picked up one of the worms. It was slick and very alive, and for a second, I had in my palm a creature that felt strangely neutral, as if whatever power it had was not intention, but permission. The skin was thinner than I expected. It left a slight wetness on my fingers. "Don't," a voice said. It was Aaron's voice right near my ear, though I had not seen him move. He lay with his hand on another worm, eyes clear and wide. "Don't make it fidget." I let the worm slide back into its hollow, as if there were a negotiation I had not been introduced to. My fingers smelled of dirt. I felt the world tilt by small degrees. Maybe the worms had always been there. Perhaps there was an ancestor of a superstition, an older camp myth. Maybe the kids had trained themselves into a pattern so complete it sought outward expression. I didn't have a neat explanation. I had only the fact of the hollows, and the fact of the synchronized calm which felt like an effect, not a cause. I climbed out of the tunnel with dirt beneath my nails, and a heart I had to stop and steady at the top. Night had become very clear. The clearing was quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I ran to the director's cabin and pounded on the door until someone with better sleep hygiene than I opened, yawning. I told them where the tunnel was. I told them about the hollows. He listened like a man trying to be practical in the face of extraordinary things. "We can call," he began, and then he stopped and seemed to weigh the decision. He had a look of a person checking his watch in his head and measuring it against the calendar. "We need to make sure no one is playing a prank," he said finally. We went back together with a flashlight and Dan, who was suddenly painfully normal, and another counselor, and we stood on the tunnel mouth and shone light in and saw the hollows. The children were there, in rows, and the worms with them. The director said softly, "Maybe they crawled down there to sleep." "They live down there," Jamie murmured without lifting her head. "It keeps things quiet." We tried to get them to come up. We offered sweets, games, a promise of s'mores and a canoe ride. The children answered only in the soft refrains. "Soft is patience, soft is peace." Their voices made the tunnel seem longer. Dan suggested we call the parents. The director hesitated and asked whether it would be better to wait until morning. Waiting, of course, is a kind of consent. There's a terrible, simple truth about institutions. They prefer small compromises over big disruptions. They prefer explanations that fit their budget. We took the worm boxes above ground then, in a small attempt at containment, and placed them beneath the watchful porch of the director's cabin. We put a rope across the clearing and told the kids it was a no-entry zone. We staged paperwork and muttered about liability. We made plans to call child protection the next morning. The kids did not argue. They sat on their bunks and hummed and, if anything, smiled like guests at the end of a long, satisfying meal. You'd think the presence of officials would break something. You'd think a knock from the world would disrupt the bubble. But institutions have their own rituals and their own reasons for not acting. When the parent who came the next day asked, "Is this normal?" the director shrugged. "Kids get strange," he repeated. "They form attachments. It's harmless." It was not harmless. The counselors who had been missing recovered in the sense of being found, but they were quieter. The child's inhaler reappeared in the infirmary unmarked, and the boy with the inhaler claimed to have borrowed it. I asked the director privately if I could leave. He said no, there was work to be done. He offered me coffee that tasted like it had been reheated 3 times and looked at me with a measure of kindness that was, in its own way, part of the pattern. He did not tell the parents the truth about the hollows. He told them the children had been creating a nature project. The parents, pressed between trust and distance, left with hugs and the kind of gratitude that is always ready to believe someone else. After that, the camp spread its rituals like a disease spreads pattern. The phrase "softest peace" became an invocation at the beginning of activities. We tried to keep things light. We taught canoeing and archery, and we scheduled a talent show. The children complied. They performed small acts that felt rehearsed, a song about frogs, a dance about the lake. They took questions in a manner of politeness that felt like a contract. When one boy fell from the climbing wall and hit his head, he did not cry. He sat very still and then said he didn't like the noise. The camp nurse bandaged him and told me to breathe. "It's shock," she said, and I wanted to believe her. I began to sense the edges of a contagion I could not trace. It wasn't merely imitation, it was enforcement. Where before the box had been an object of affection, now it was a regulator. Children would hold up fingers for permission before reaching for the box. They would close their mouths in a way that looked like a child's attempt at piety. They would lock eyes with one another, and in those exchanged glances, seemed to be checking temperatures. I tried to talk to Jamie about this. One afternoon I sat with her on the crooked porch swing and let the sun fall flat across her knees. "Do you miss anything?" I asked clumsily. She looked at me without answering for a long time, and then she whispered, "I miss being loud sometimes, but he doesn't like that." "Who is he?" I pressed. She looked at me as if I had misheard. "Mr. Soft," she said. "The head counselor." I wanted to laugh and not laugh. I wanted to shake her and make her speak plain. Instead, I folded my hands and tried to be the one anchor for the small, bobbing boat of her life. "We have to be more than followers," I said, and it sounded thinner than I intended. She nodded as if she'd been prepared to hear that exact thing. She might have agreed without understanding why. The real turning point came one night when I went down the tunnel and found a knot of adult-sized blankets in a hollow, one that had not been there before. The breath of a person was in that hollow in the way we can recognize by sound alone. Long, regular, practiced. There was a collar of a shirt poking from behind leaves. I almost called the director, but my voice felt rattled. When I touched the sleeve, it was warm and alive. Someone rolled over and turned toward me, and I recognized the face as Rachel, a senior staffer who had been in charge of drama. Her eyes were open and glassy, but fixed. She said my name like a greeting, and then turned her head toward the worm and smiled steadily. "He's teaching us how to stop hurting," she said, while the worms innocently pulsed in their hollows. I did not know what to do. I did what I could think of. I carried Rachel to the office, we made coffee, we discussed options, and we finally called a counselor from the city to come by in the morning. There was a procedural conversation, a form. The director told me to keep things calm. The director, who had once been an advocate of children's creativity, now resembled someone balancing the books of a small fraternity. He seemed to prefer a solution that would keep the camp's reputation intact until the season ended. The night before the city councillor arrived, I went back into the woods because I needed to see whether what I had seen was real, whether the hollows were real, whether the simplicity of the worms could contain such a grip. The tunnel was darker than I remembered. I moved my light slowly, and the hollows blinked back at me like an audience. In one hollow, a new child lay curled, her braid unbuttoned, and beside her a worm lay like a comma. I whispered, "Wake up." She opened her eyes for a long time and said, "Will you be good?" She meant it as a question directed at me and a plea. I realized then we had been mistaken about who was being trained. It wasn't the kids being taught how to quiet themselves. It was us, the adults. The camp's normalcy was being reframed as an optional state, and we had the choice to resist or to let the quiet be the law. I took my hand away from the child's shoulder because I didn't want to be part of an enforcement I couldn't see in full. The next morning the city councillor arrived, and to his credit he was thorough. He asked questions, checked medical histories, and sat with the kids in the dining hall and asked them about their days. They answered as if they had practiced politeness to the point of art. He watched the box and he frowned, and he requested a transfer to keep certain kids under observation. I remember thinking, with a brief relapse into hope, that perhaps this would be the moment where everything snapped back into order. It did not. That afternoon, the councillor's car was gone. He had left his bag by the office door, and then simply not returned. There were letters on his desk that he had never filed, and a cup that still smelled of coffee. The director said he must have had an emergency and taken off. There was no police presence. There was no town hall. The camp's small machinery churned on. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch and watched the children in the clearing, their silhouettes neat and patient. Their faces were lit by a moon that looked indifferent. They sang a quiet song I could not catch, and I could not decide if it was a hymn or a litany or a bedtime tune. The refrain wound through the air. Soft is peace. Soft is patience. It wrapped around the director's laughter like fog around a lamppost. That night, I packed a small bag while the camp sighed and hummed sleep songs. I wanted to leave. I wanted to call my mother and tell her to come pick me up. I wanted to be anywhere this was not. But there is a small, selfish thing about being in the middle of a thing. You have access to small truths. You can see how other people behave. Even cowardice is, when witnessed, useful. It tells you the limits of the institution. I had planned a route out of the camp for hours. I kept to the shadows and moved like someone who had rehearsed leaving a long time ago. The children were assembled in the clearing when I passed. They stood like an audience waiting for something. Their faces held a stillness that was patient and final at once. Jamie stepped forward. Her braid hung loose. She smiled in a way that had been practiced so often it looked natural. "You're leaving?" she asked. The question had the innocent tilt of childhood, but the weight of something adult. Her voice was even and lacked the brittle note of improvisation. I hesitated. I couldn't say what I wanted to, how the hollows had looked, how the worms had been ordinary and turned into anchors, how the counselor from the city had vanished. The words would sound too dramatic, or worse, unbelievable. Instead, I offered a pale truth. "I need to go." Jamie nodded as if she'd known all along. "You can be soft too," she said. "Soft is peace." Behind her, the children murmured the refrain. There was no pleading in their expression. It was an invitation. There are ways of being in the world that look like kind offers and are actually a trade. They wanted me to stay by offering me the idea of an easier life. Stop struggling, stop resisting, accept calm as the entire atmosphere. The thought itself had an appeal, to close the eyes and make the noise stop. For a suspended second I understood the surrender, and hated it for its simplicity. I took a step back. The clearing's air felt like a gauze placed over my lungs. The kids watched me. The director did not emerge to stop me. The world had reorganized itself so that being nervous looked like defiance. I walked away. I didn't take the road the director would have approved. I cut through the bit of pine that led to the back field and the chain-link fence that separated camp from the highway. There's a part of leaving that is loud, the slamming of a gate, the crack of a twig. But I did not run. I walked fast, hands in my pockets to steady the small tremor in my fingers, the flashlight far from necessary now because dawn was at the horizon and it felt like a promise. I hit the highway and thumbed a ride into the nearest town, where the diner had coffee golden and real. I sat and tried to write down what had occurred. I tried to capture the image of the worms like punctuation in the hollows, of Jamie's patient face, of the director's shrug. Words fail at a certain point. Language is a net, and sometimes the thing you want to hold has the texture of water. Later that day I called the director and demanded answers. He spoke carefully, the way someone talks around a porcelain object they don't want to break. "We had professionals in," he said. "We did what we thought best." He offered a series of corporate phrases: incident report, parental notifications. He sounded exhausted in the way of someone who had been carrying a small absurdity up a long flight of stairs and had at last set it down. I asked him about the holes. He hesitated. He used the phrase, "It might have been communal sleeping." He used the phrase, "children experiment." He used words that I had heard before and had become used to shrug off. He did not say what I wanted, which was to have him admit mistake, to have him rouse the camp and make an altar of truth and say, "We failed these children." He preferred the slow-motion forgetting of bureaucracy. That is not to say nothing happened after I left. There were calls, letters, and somebody from the state did come to the camp months later. There was an investigation that lasted for a long time and mapped little more than the edges. They found hollows. They found worms. They found a pattern of absentee adults. They did not find convincing proof that something inhuman had taken root. The town, wanting to protect itself, closed ranks. Camps are good for a town's economy. People like Summers and simple lore. I tried to sleep, and sleep refused me. Memory is a peculiar thing. If you tilt it, it slides in ways that can change the shape of a night. Images stuck to the back of my eyelids. I could see the worms under fingernail light. I could hear the children's synchronized breathing echoing across the tunnels, and always, like a refrain, the phrase returned, "Soft is peace." Sometimes in a late-night fog of coffee and worry, I would find myself repeating the lines to test them. Softest peace. It felt like a child's incantation and like an edict. Once, I said it aloud and heard, not the echo of an empty room, but a memory of Jamie saying it as if it were the simplest remedy in the world. The phrase had become a hinge on which the children's world turned. Months after I left, I drove back to the camp because cowardice has a specialty. It lives sometimes in people who leave and think they have escaped a place. I wanted to see whether the clearing looked the same, whether the stump had been removed, whether the shoebox was a memory. The town had rearranged. The camp had new paint in places, and the director had been replaced with someone younger and deft at PR. The girls who had been in my cabin came by sometimes during the fall and told stories. They were quieter than they had been. They did not mention the worms unless someone asked. The director insisted the whole thing had been a teachable moment. I went into the woods anyway. The stump still stood. The clearing had a neatness that suggested human care, and yet when I walked the path, a soft pressure upon my chest made me stop. There was no shoebox on the stump. There was not always an object necessary to the thing it had once represented. Sometimes the form is sufficient. Rituals continue without the original center. I found a line of small stones leading into the teeth of the woods, stones placed at intervals like breadcrumbs. They were recent enough that the moss had not yet spread fully. I followed them and found a circle of children by the edge of the lake, the same group, older by a season, ankles scarred from summers. They sat as if in a small theater. When they saw me, they did not jump up. They watched me with an attention that felt like a direct gaze through a window that had not been opened. "You're back," Jamie said. Her braid was grayer, or maybe I was remembering the brightness. "Did you miss us?" "I couldn't," I began. She smiled at me the same way she had on the porch that summer. "You can be soft now. It helps." The boy with the inhaler had his hands neatly folded. He had the inhaler tucked cleanly into his sleeve. He coughed once, a small sound that did not seem urgent. "Where's Mr. Soft?" I asked, because it seemed a question that would test whether what I had seen had been a single aberration or a continued practice. Jamie looked at me like a person who had been asked a math problem they had solved long ago. "He doesn't need to be seen," she said. "He is always here." She tapped her chest like someone indicating that an internal compass had been set. I couldn't press further. There was a choice to be made then that wasn't about the children but about the world you wanted to live in. I walked away from that circle and felt the weight of their watching like a hand. I didn't run. I drove to the edge of town and sat in my car and looked at the sky and thought about the soft things you let into your life because they promise ease. I thought about how easily adults will trade discomfort for quiet, how easily institutions will prefer minimal scandal to maximal care. The final image that stays with me is of the children assembled in the clearing, hands folded like a congregation ready for a blessing, mouths moving in the same cadence like a prayer without doctrine. "Soft is peace," they would chant, and the words became, in my mind, both a promise and a warning. I don't pretend to have answers. I don't know if Mr. Soft was animate with a power beyond the ordinary, or simply acted as a fulcrum around which children could build a system of control that turned inward and smoothed over the messy edges of childhood. Perhaps both are true, and perhaps neither. The truth is that something small found willing hearts and was fed by adult inattention and institutional slowness. When people ask me why I tell the story, I tell them it's a warning wrapped in a confession. I tell them to watch small things, to listen to the soft phrases that become laws, to notice when care becomes containment. I tell them to pay attention to what children are taught to regard as comfort. If you have ever worked with kids, you know the dangerous luxury of assuming they will be fine. There's one more thing I remember clearly. The children, in the final moments I witnessed, stood in the clearing and looked like a single patient thing. Jamie met my eyes and asked, in a voice that sounded so tender it might have been a kindness, "Do you want to be good too?" I left without answering. I left with the taste of earth under my nails and the echo of their breathing on the back of my neck. I did not go back to teaching that summer. I took a job doing something anonymous in town where the smell of coffee was less complicated. I tried to write and couldn't. The phrase, the refrain, had lodged in me like a splinter. Sometimes late at night when the city is quiet and the refrigerator hums and a bus sighs down the avenue, I hear a pattern of breaths in the dark and my chest tightens. I imagine them in the clearing, their faces patient and white in the moon. I imagine them saying softly the lines that rearrange the camp, "Soft is patience, soft is peace." The image hangs in my mind not as an explanation, but as an echo. It is a refrain without an answer, a line in a song whose chorus you cannot unlearn. If this story makes you uncomfortable, good. I do not mean to frighten for the sake of fright. I mean to remind, be wary of the small things that demand to be your whole world. If you had to pick the strangest camp election you've ever heard of, tell it in the comments. I'm curious which small things people have let grow. I still think of the children sometimes, and of the way a worm in a shoebox can be named a leader and become one. I think of Jamie's smile and of Aaron's careful hands. I think about the director and his wind-up laugh and the quiet compromises he chose. And on some nights, when the dark slides close and I am alone, I hear a faint murmur that might be my memory or might be something else, a small chorus that keeps time with my heart. Soft is peace, soft is patience. The words keep their cadence like a heartbeat and I cannot make them stop. If you liked this unsettling reading, like and subscribe for more stories like this and check the description for links and sources.